Madam President,
The junior senator from Texas.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise today to bring attention to the serious humanitarian crisis at our southern border. Right now, as we speak, thousands of children who have entered the United States illegally sit in crowded detention centers, wrapped up in emergency blankets. Hundreds, even thousands of miles away from home. They are without their families, without their parents. Many of them have been trafficked, have been physically and sexually abused along the way. U.S. Customs and Border Protection reported that just last month alone, 29,792 unaccompanied children came across our border, including 2,942 children under the age of 12. All of these children came here without their parents. And they have come here in large numbers because they know that President Biden is promising them amnesty. The illegal immigrants coming across our southern border right now are not just children. President Biden's Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, has said, quote, "We are on pace to encounter more individuals on the southwest border than we have in the last 20 years. In February, more than 100,000 illegal immigrants came across our southern border, according to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which is 3 times the number of illegal immigrants who came through the southern border in February of 2019. And it's almost 6 times the number of illegal immigrants who came through our southern border in February of 2018. The Biden administration refuses to call this a crisis, but that's what it is. We have a humanitarian crisis, and we also have a security crisis. Of the over 100,000 illegal immigrants who came here in February, 71% of them are single adults, according to Pew Research Center. The Biden administration's policy has been to welcome these illegal immigrants and to halt or slow deportations as much as possible. When Joe Biden became president, he immediately halted construction of the border wall. He ended the Remain in Mexico policy, an incredible foreign policy victory President Trump negotiated with Mexico, which stipulated that illegal immigrants from Central America crossing illegally through Mexico to seek asylum in the United States would stay in Mexico during the pendency of their proceedings. President Biden ended that, ripping apart that international agreement, and instead he reinstated the failed policy of catch and release. So now, when we apprehend illegal immigrants, we let them go, including illegal immigrants who are criminals, who are convicted criminals guilty of violent crimes. President Biden's political decisions have produced a crisis, and a crisis that is growing. What the Biden administration has made clear in the last 2 months is that their priority is illegal immigrants and not American citizens. That's why, in just a moment, I'm going to propound a unanimous consent request that the Senate pass Kate's Law. Kate's Law is named for Kate Steinle, who was 32 years old when she was tragically killed on a San Francisco pier by an illegal immigrant who had several felony convictions and had been deported from the United States, not once, not twice, not 3 times, not even 4 times, had been deported 5 times. But the revolving door of our border, this violent criminal kept being deported, and he kept coming back, and he kept coming back, and he kept coming back, and beautiful Kate Steinle was shot and killed because of our broken immigration system. Kate's Law is common sense legislation. It would amend federal law to impose a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years for any illegal reentry offense. Kate's Law is critical to ensuring that illegal immigrants who have been deported, especially those with violent criminal records, are deterred from repeatedly entering the country illegally over and over and over again. If the illegal immigrant violent criminal who killed Kate Steinle had been in prison for illegally entering the United States the 5th time, Kate would still be here today. I've had the opportunity to meet Kate Steinle's family. They don't understand why our system is broken. They don't understand why we keep letting in violent, criminal, illegal aliens over and over and over again. And I'll tell you, the American people, roughly 80% of Americans agree with Kate's law. This is common sense legislation. We're about to see a Democrat object to it because today's Democratic Party doesn't care what the American people say. But if this were in the realm of sanity, Kate's law would pass 100 to nothing. Look, we can have disagreements about legal immigration, about what the rules are, but when it comes to violent criminal illegal aliens who enter the country illegally over and over and over again, it ought to be real simple. We ought to be able to come together as Democrats and Republicans and say, all right, let's draw the line there. We don't need more murderers in America. I've spent a lot of time down in the valley in the Texas border. I've spent a lot of time with agents of the Border Patrol. Tomorrow, I'm going back to the border to see for myself what the conditions are like right now. I'm leading a delegation of 17 other senators, and we're going to go talk to Customs and Border Patrol agents. We're going to meet with CBP leadership. We're going to meet with law enforcement and community leaders. We're going to tour the detention facilities directly. Now, you may not see that on TV because the Biden administration is refusing to allow the press to see the facilities. For 4 years, Democrats went on and on and on about kids in cages. Now, those cages were built by Barack Obama, and they're bigger and fuller under Joe Biden. And the Biden administration doesn't want you to see the Biden cages. So they've declared a media blackout that reporters are not allowed. The Trump administration allowed the media to go to the border. The Obama administration allowed the media to go to the border. The Bill Clinton administration allowed the media to go to the border. The George W. Bush administration allowed the media to go to the border. But Joe Biden wants to cover up the crisis that his administration has created. And it's a crisis that sadly Senate Democrats are complicit in creating as well. We've yet to have a single Senate Democrat willing to break with the Biden administration on the unfolding humanitarian crisis on the border. The worse it gets, the more kids that are abused, the more kids that are assaulted, the more Americans that are put at risk of COVID, the more Americans that are put at risk of violent crime. At some point, I hope and pray we will see Senate Democrats willing to say, enough is enough. It's time to stop being angry partisans, and it's time to come together with common sense and protect the American citizens. For that reason, Madam President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of S. 890, and that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The junior senator from New Mexico.
Madam President, there's not a single Democratic senator in this body who believes that someone who commits a violent crime should not feel the full weight of the U.S. judicial system for their crimes. I hope my friend from Texas would agree with that. I don't think there's a member in this body, Democratic, Republican, Independent, the staff, not a one. I think the same holds true for our colleagues that work just down the corridor from us in the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, we must do everything in our power to make certain that those engaged in violent crimes face prosecution and feel the full weight of the law. That's not just bipartisan, that's the right thing to do. Where I disagree with my colleague is the assertion that immigrants are inherently criminal. They're not. People that our kids go to school with, that we work with, that grow our food in America, that work to prepare that food or even stock the shelves, teach in classrooms, serve in the United States military, defending our freedoms in the United States of America. So, to my friend from Texas, this seems to be a continuance of the harmful proposals from the Trump administration. I certainly think that many of my colleagues from the other side of the aisle in the U.S. Senate also disagree with the hateful pronouncements from Steve Miller. This feels like a continuance of that. To strike fear in Americans and to breed distrust in immigrants. Now, I agree with my colleague that we have to work together to stop that false narrative. This false narrative must stop because it's not contributing to fixing the broken immigration system we have in the United States. I agree with my colleague that we should come together and work in a bipartisan way to learn from one another. I'm new to this chamber, but I'm not new to these challenges. I certainly hope that my colleagues that are traveling to the border, and I commend them for doing so, because this is an important conversation we should be having. I hope they travel to Matamoros. I don't know if my colleague from Texas has done that. I did. I traveled down there with a group of colleagues. We had a chance to visit with Border Patrol in El Paso. We had a chance to visit with Border Patrol in Antelope Wells in New Mexico and Lordsburg in New Mexico. I've had the honor of traveling down into the Rio Grande Valley, down to Brownsville. We had a chance to visit with folks on the front lines, not just wearing the green uniform with our Border Patrol and those working with the Department of Homeland Security, but those that are also providing humanitarian relief. Those camps in Matamoros that I went to, they still exist. And one of the questions that needs to be asked is, what are these kids going through? What are they thinking about to travel thousands of miles because of the concern that they have for their own health and well-being? I hope we can have that conversation and solve this problem. So let's find a way to work together. And I said it before and I'll say it again. We need to go after criminals and felons, not children and families. In truth, I think we can get there. So as I close, I just say, let's be a beacon of hope to the most vulnerable. Let's make sure we go after these criminals and felons wherever they may be and they feel the full weight of the law. But that when it comes to the broken immigration system in America, let's work together to fix it. Therefore, I object.
Madam President.
Objection is heard.
Madam President.
The junior senator from Texas.
Madam President, I appreciate the senator from New Mexico's warm sentiments. But the American people can distinguish the difference between talk and action. Senator from New Mexico suggested that all Democrats support holding criminals to account. I would suggest the facts are precisely to the contrary. Just 2 weeks ago on the floor of this body, we introduced an amendment to provide that $1,400 government stimulus checks should not go to criminals currently in prison. Every single Senate Democrat voted against that. That amendment failed by 1 vote. If even one Democrat had said, okay, that's reasonable, it would have passed. Yesterday, I introduced multiple unanimous consent requests to stop money from going to convicted criminals in prison and to send the money instead to the Crime Victims Fund. A Democrat objected. I then said, all right, if you don't want to do all criminals, How about murderers? Can we agree if you were convicted of homicide, if you killed somebody, let's not send you a government check, let's send it to the Crime Victims Fund? The Democrats objected. I said, all right, how about rapists? The Democrats objected. I said, how about child molesters? Surely we can all agree child molesters are not worthy of a $1,400 taxpayer government bonus given by the Democrats. The Democrats objected. So with all due respect to my friend from New Mexico, it is not the case that Democrats support holding prisoners to account. Today in the Rules Committee, the Democrats are pushing forward an election bill, the Corrupt Politicians Act, which would allow every felon in America who has been released from prison to vote. It would allow murderers to vote, rapists to vote, child molesters to vote. So it is not the case that Democrats are willing to stand up to violent crime. Now, there are a couple of things the senator from Mexico said that I wrote down. He said the only thing he disagreed with was, quote, the assertion that immigrants are inherently criminal. Well, I challenge anyone watching this exchange, read the transcript. I'm glad he disagrees with that assertion. That assertion never came from my mouth. I am the son of an immigrant who came from Cuba. We are a nation of immigrants. I'm not remotely asserting that immigrants are inherently criminal. There's a right way to come, and that's to come legally. But Kate's law isn't about immigrants generally. It only applies to criminals. It is immigrants that have a criminal conviction, that have an aggravated felony conviction. So when my friend from New Mexico says we need to focus on felons, and he closed his remarks with the following quote, we need to go after criminals and felons, not children and families. Madam President, Kate's law does exactly that. If the senator from New Mexico believed the words he said, the next words out of his mouth would not have been, I object. By virtue of objecting, he prevented us from, in a bipartisan way, going after criminals and felons. Kate's law is targeted at those criminals and felons. Not targeted at kids. It's targeted at criminals and felons. And I would ask the senator from New Mexico and every Senate Democrat, what would you say to Kate Steinle's family? I've heard them testify in the Senate Judiciary Committee. I've visited with them personally. If you were looking them in the eyes, what would you say to a system where Kate Steinle's murderer was deported 5 times, multiple criminal convictions? I'm the original author of Kate's law. We voted on this on the Senate floor multiple times. Every time we voted, every single Democratic senator has voted against Kate's law. You don't get to vote against Kate's law. You don't get to vote against stopping violent criminals from repeatedly entering the country illegally and then claim you're against violent criminals repeatedly entering the country illegally. Actions mean more than words. And unfortunately, the actions of today's Democratic Party is extreme and out of touch with the American people who we were elected to represent. I yield the floor.
Madam President,
The junior senator from Florida.
I rise today to discuss another issue in the Democrats' massive COVID spending bill that we need to fix. My Democrat colleagues want to keep spending into oblivion, taking our national debt to $30 trillion. Madam President, this would be bad enough on its own, but tucked into the bloated spending package were new tax hikes on self-employed individuals. President Biden and the Democrats didn't talk about it, and they certainly aren't talking about it as they travel the nation to brag about their bad bill. Democrats are quietly raising taxes, hoping the American people don't notice. The $1.9 trillion so-called American Rescue Plan Act, of which less than 10% went to actually help fight COVID, and 1% to vaccines, had several tax increases and burdensome reporting requirements, including one that significantly impacts gig workers, those who have been severely impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. Starting in 2022, this bill requires many contractors with gig economy companies like Uber, DoorDash, Airbnb, and Lyft to file 1099 forms when they previously would not have. The new requirement dramatically lowers the annual 1099 reporting threshold from 20,000 and 200 transactions to just $600 and eliminates the transaction minimum. In late February, before the Democrats rushed their spending bill through Congress on a purely partisan basis, a coalition of groups wrote to Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer asking that this onerous new provision, which has nothing to do with addressing the coronavirus crisis, be removed or at least reconsidered. The letter was signed by groups such as the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council, the National Asian American Chamber of Commerce, National Association for the Self-Employed, United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and the National Association of Women Business Owners. Madam President, after receiving such a letter, one would think that Democrats would want to reconsider. Raising taxes and reporting requirements in the midst of a pandemic, this is never good policy, but I can't think of any worse timing. Of course, Democrats kept the provision buried deep within the bill, hoping the American public wouldn't notice. The Democrats' new reporting requirements are effectively a tax hike and will ultimately hurt low and middle income contractors, the self-employed, and freelancers, many of which have been devastated by the pandemic, while federal and state governments will collect billions more in income tax revenue. Madam President, my Democrat colleagues want the American public to believe this is about catching tax cheats. And to be clear, any attempt to evade taxes and to defraud the public by not following the law should be condemned, and Congress should appropriately address it. However, a massive new reporting requirement on gig workers, many just trying to make ends meet in the midst of this pandemic, is not about catching tax fraud. It's about punishing the self-employed and raising revenues for the Democrats' massive spending plans. It wasn't that long ago that President Biden promised that he wouldn't raise taxes on anyone making under $400,000. Obviously, that was not true. But this isn't the first time Democrats have tried to quietly increase taxes and saddle the self-employed with new requirements like this. They did it with Obamacare, when they required businesses to send 1099 forms for all purchases of goods and services over $600 annually. They quickly learned how unpopular and harmful this provision was, and they quickly repealed it. The Obama administration even praised the repeal as a big win for the self-employed. I guess some never learn. What I'm proposing is very simple. It's what the Democrats supported in 2011 when they repealed this bad tax increase in Obamacare. Today, I want to remove this new reporting requirement and simply reinstate the previous law back into U.S. code. Increasing reporting requirements on our gig workers will create new and unexpected challenges for independent, self-employed workers and entrepreneurs who are already facing an incredible burden created by the coronavirus. Increasing costs and regulations on already struggling Americans is wrong, and I hope all my colleagues will join me today and repeal this bad policy. Madam President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Senate 948, introduced earlier today. I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object, Madam President.
The senior senator from Oregon.
Madam President, the senator from Florida claims to be looking out for gig workers and freelancers. The reality is very different. What is in the bill, which the senator from Florida apparently opposes, is a way to make sure that these workers can get the information they need to help meet their existing tax obligations. And without this information, for example, workers may lose out on benefits that would help them pay rent and buy groceries. They could inadvertently lose out on important tax benefits like the Earned Income Tax Credit. The rescue plan, of course, expands the Earned Income Tax Credit. We want to make sure that every eligible worker could get that financial help. And finally, without reporting, workers might jeopardize the size of their future Social Security benefits, putting their retirement security at risk. So, what the senator from Florida is up to here would deprive American entrepreneurs of the information they need to keep business records, comply with tax requirements, claim important federal benefits. For these reasons, I strongly object to this request for unanimous consent, and I yield the floor.
Objection is heard.
Madam President?
The junior senator from Florida.
Okay, that sounded good, but this is clearly a tax increase. It's a massive tax increase, and it's a massive new reporting requirement on already struggling Americans. Our focus ought to be on helping support American workers, especially these gig employee workers that have been hurt so badly. I'm disappointed my colleague wants to increase costs and regulations on American families. What's strange is that my colleague from Oregon voted to repeal this bad provision when Democrats added to Obamacare. So what's crazy is, why is he okay today with raising taxes on the American people now? This is all part of the Democrats' tax and spend agenda, and it's just the beginning. Let's remember, with the last spending bill that Democrats passed, we will have $30 trillion of debt. As governor of Florida, we cut taxes 100 times, and we paid off a third of our state debt. We have to think that way here. How can we grow this economy, reduce the cost for Americans, not increase the cost of Americans? These bad type of policies will ruin our economy and the shot at the American dream, which we all believe in. But I'm going to fight every day to get government out of the way and make sure that doesn't happen. I yield the floor. Madam President,
The junior senator from Florida.
I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President.
The senior senator from Utah.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to suspend the quorum call.
Without objection.
I also ask unanimous consent that at the conclusion of my remarks, I be allowed to prepare and present an excerpt of my speech in Spanish. I'll provide transcripts both in English and of Spanish of those paragraphs.
Without objection.
Madam President, I've read the accounts, and so have many of you. A young mother from Honduras, 2 young sisters from Guatemala, a 6-year-old child from El Salvador. They're all told by a local cartel that for a price, a better life awaits them in America. They're told, as evidenced by those chanting Biden, Biden at the border, that this new president has opened the borders and that amnesty is imminent. So get in while you can. These vulnerable people are flocking to smugglers and violent criminals and paying them all that they have for their chance to get in while they can. In the last month, traffickers have allegedly made as much as $14 million a week smuggling men, women, and children across the border. And once indebted to cartels and coyotes, the price these vulnerable people pay is far more costly than money. According to media reports, men are used as slaves, women are raped endlessly. In fact, a third of the women making their way to the border are reportedly sexually assaulted, and 68% of the people coming across the border are physically assaulted. Children are rented, trafficked, and recycled, as they put it, forced to pose as the child of one illegal immigrant after another to activate the so-called Flores get-out-of-jail-free card. One former Border Patrol agent told me that the smugglers prefer to use babies because they're unable to tell Border Patrol agents that these are not, in fact, their parents. And what of those who escape the clutches of the cartels? Well, estimates of how many children are currently in Customs and Border Patrol custody vary from more than 4,000 children to well over 15,000. Thousands of these children are being held, packed into housing facilities for well over the 72-hour limit required by Flores, and with no end in sight. The Biden administration is doing all it can to hide the humanitarian crisis created by its own immigration policies, a disaster that Secretary Mayorkas refuses to acknowledge as a crisis. They've denied media access and appear to be enforcing an unofficial gag order on Border Patrol agents. Journalists have not been permitted inside the detention facilities since President Biden took office. Now, it shouldn't be a surprise to any of us that the Biden administration's open border policies have resulted in this overwhelming crisis. And a crisis it is. This is what then candidate Biden promised us in the very first Democratic presidential primary debate. He promised us that when he became president, there would be immediate surges along the border. Unfortunately, in this case, he has delivered exactly what he promised. So how exactly did he deliver? Well, first, he made it known that once he was elected, the border would be open for business. Then he reversed course on a number of Trump-era common sense immigration policies. This incentivized vulnerable people to entrust their lives and the lives of their children to dangerous coyotes and cartels. What are these policies? The Safe Third Country policy, implemented by the Trump administration, requires asylum seekers to apply for asylum in the first safe country in which they arrive. President Biden has moved to repeal that rule. The expansion of the Flores settlement agreement also creates perverse incentives in our immigration law. Flores is about protecting children, and yet in the application of the expansion, we've put children in even greater danger of becoming victims of trafficking and cartel manipulation. The Biden policy of keeping all unaccompanied alien minors in the United States, as my fellow senator from Utah has pointed out, actually incentivizes parents to separate themselves from their children by entrusting their children to a cartel or a coyote to bring them to the United States for their chance at amnesty. By moving to loosen the requirements of asylum and expand its application, President Biden has invited immigrants who could find safety in other regions of their own country or an adjacent country to make the dangerous journey to the United States. What we need are clear requirements to preserve the opportunities for asylum for those who need it the most. No, America is the land to which those seeking a better life look for relief. And we should provide relief where we can. We also have a duty to protect our border, our citizens, and our laws, our national interests. And at the very least, we have a duty to eliminate policies that empower cartels and coyotes to exploit women and children. We must stop incentivizing vulnerable people to make a journey that will very rarely lead to the outcome they desire. To this end, and together with Congressman Andy Biggs and several of my fellow senators, I've introduced the Stopping Border Surges Act to address some of the more egregious loopholes in our immigration laws. This bill remedies the expansion of the Flores Settlement Agreement that puts so many children in danger by requiring the release of minors with any adult claiming to be the child's parent. It provides expedited processing for unaccompanied minors from all countries. Process is currently available only to children from Mexico and Canada. Immediate processing will blunt the incentive for parents to send their children on this dangerous journey alone. In an effort to end the trafficking of children by cartels, it strengthens protections for children released to adults within the United States. It tightens the asylum process so that we can better serve those who genuinely need the protections we can offer. And it incentivizes immigrants to enter our country through official ports of entry. This bill offers a new common sense series of reforms that will help stem the flood of immigrants at our border and free vulnerable women and children from the clutches of the cartels and of the coyotes. And for that reason, I urge all of my colleagues to support it, to join it, to vote for it. And now, having previously received consent, I'd like to conclude these remarks in Spanish. Remarks directed specifically to those who might be considering making the dangerous, perilous journey to the southern border of the United States or sending their families. Por favor, no manden a sus esposas e hijas por esta jornada para ser abusadas sexualmente por los coyotes y los carteles. Escuchamos cuento tras cuento de traficantes secuestrando mujeres y niños aún mucho tiempo después de cruzar la frontera. En el año 2019, el New York Times documentó decenas de encuentros de estas mismas mujeres. Este es solo uno de estos cuentos de Melvin, una madre de 3 hijos con 36 años de Guatemala. Por muchas semanas, los hombres que ella pagó para traerle segura a los Estados Unidos le drogaron con pastillas y cocaína. No le permitieron salir ni para bañarse. Ella dijo, creo que desde que me pusieron en ese cuarto, me mataron. Nos violaron tantas veces que dejaron de vernos como seres humanos. Por favor, escuchen la historia de Melvin. No hagan que sea la historia de su familia. Madam President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-884, and that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The senior senator from Illinois.
Madam President, we face a challenge at the border. There's no question about it. But it really strikes me as strange, maybe unusual, for members of the Senate from the other side of the aisle to come and yearn for those wonderful days of the Trump administration when it came to the issue of immigration and border policy. Remember when we had the longest government shutdown in history, paralyzing immigration courts and other agencies? It was, of course, a shutdown that was sanctioned by the President of the United States over his immigration demands. Under President Trump, the Department of Homeland Security, incidentally, experienced unprecedented leadership problems. The Department of Homeland Security lurched from one secretary or acting secretary to the next. Listen to this, 6 different secretaries in that agency in 4 years. Only 2 Senate confirmed. More agency heads in the last 4 years under President Trump than in the 13-year history of the Department of Homeland Security prior to President Trump. They couldn't keep anybody on the job. They quit, they were fired. Nobody could agree with this president's bizarre ideas on what to do with immigration. Are we longing for a return to those days? President Trump unlawfully diverted billions of dollars in Department of Defense funds to build a wasteful, ineffective border wall, which was supposed to be paid for by the Mexicans, if I remember. And then he created a humanitarian crisis at the border with a policy known as zero tolerance. Zero tolerance. I remember when Attorney General Sessions came before the American people and actually quoted the Bible to justify the forcible removal of infants, toddlers, and children from their parents' arms. Over 2,200 children were physically separated from their parents as part of this zero tolerance policy. It wasn't until a federal court judge in Southern California finally said to the Trump administration, I demand that you account for these children and I demand that you reunite them with their parents, that they set out to do it. Today, years later, years after zero tolerance, there are still hundreds of children separated at that time that have never been reunited with their parents. Do we want to return to those wonderful days of the Trump administration immigration policy? I don't think so. Children in cages, children lost adrift on the bureaucratic sea doesn't speak well of America's values. President Trump tried to end asylum protections for children and other vulnerable migrants. He cut aid to Central America, directly harming efforts to fight poverty and violence in the region. More refugees were driven to our border because the president shut down legal avenues for immigration and blocked all assistance to stabilize the Northern Triangle countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Now comes the senator from Utah, and he and I have worked on legislation together in the past. I know that we can find bipartisan solutions. I don't think that this approach is one of them, but perhaps it is the beginning of a conversation. The president's former Republican allies in Congress claim that the real cause, the real problem behind our immigration policy is humanitarian protection for children. They claim that we can protect children by overturning these humanitarian protections, either that have been entered into a consent decree in court or by law, and subjecting children at the border to indefinite detention and deportation without adequate due process. But there's no evidence that this will deter desperate families from fleeing to our border. There is one thing the senator from Utah and I certainly agree on. Many of these children and families are being horribly, horribly exploited by coyotes and kidnappers and very bad people. Many of these people and their children are suffering in unimaginable ways because of this. I renew the plea that has been given across Central America by this administration. Don't send your people to our border. Don't send your children to our border. It is not something we should encourage under the circumstances. It has to be orderly, and this is not in many respects. There's no evidence that ending this humanitarian protection from children will deter desperate families from fleeing to our border. The bill before us today includes no assurances that children will be humanely treated or they be safe from violence once they are deported. This notion that once these children come across the border or taken into custody by the United States government, that at some time, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks later, they're turned loose again, does not dispense our moral obligation. We want these children to be safe, and that's what the laws are, the Flores decision and others. This bill does nothing to address root causes that are causing migrants to flee the Northern Triangle in record numbers. If people were migrating because of so-called legal loopholes, they'd be coming to our southern border from all over the region. Instead, the vast majority come from 3 countries, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Those countries have the highest homicide rates, some of them in the world, and girls face a constant threat of sexual violence with little prosecution from local authorities. They're doing desperate things because of the desperate situations in these countries. We're told by the senator that we have to overturn the Bipartisan Traffic Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, which passed by unanimous consent in the Senate, was signed into law by Republican President George W. Bush. But the TVPRA ensures the United States meets its international obligations to protect unaccompanied children seeking safe haven in our country. It was a response to bipartisan concern that children apprehended by the Border Patrol were being returned to countries where they might be exploited even more. Under TVPRA, unaccompanied children from the Northern Triangle are transferred to the Department of Health and Human Services and placed in deportation proceedings, which gives them a chance to finally make their case to a judge. Consider Samuel and Amelie, siblings aged 3 and 6 from Honduras. They arrived in the United States traumatized, aged 3 and 6, said nothing, silent. After being transferred to HHS, Amelie revealed that both children had been raped by drug cartel members. Without TVPRA protection, Samuel and Amelie would have been returned to Honduras and almost certain further exploitation. Democrats are trying to work on a bipartisan repair of this immigration system. It's long overdue. In 2019, after President Trump finally agreed to end the longest government shutdown in history, Congress passed an omnibus appropriations bill, including $414 million for humanitarian assistance at the border, and then passed an emergency supplemental for $4.6 billion additional funding to alleviate overcrowding at detention facilities. In 2018, Senate Democrats supported a bipartisan agreement, including robust border security and funding and dozens of provisions to strengthen border security. But President Trump threatened to veto it and instead pushed for his hardline plan with the largest cut in legal immigration in almost a century. And when it comes to refugees, after World War II, when the United States sadly turned away hundreds and thousands of ultimate victims of the Holocaust, would not accept them in refugee status, we set out to prove to the world that we had learned a valuable lesson. And we led the world in offering refugee status until President Trump, and he brought the numbers down to record low levels. That does not speak well of the United States, or it shouldn't be a source of pride of anyone reflecting on his administration. We need comprehensive immigration reform. I support it. 8 years ago, in 2013, I was part of the gang of 8 bipartisan group, 4 Republican, 4 Democratic senators. We produced a comprehensive immigration reform legislation that passed the Senate 68-32. The senator from Utah voted against it. And unfortunately, the Republicans who controlled the House of Representatives refused to consider it. So here's my invitation to the senator from Utah and everyone else interested. Let's sit down again and write that bill. Let's do it in a fashion that really does bring reform to our system. I just talked at a meeting, a bipartisan meeting on this subject earlier, and one of the senators from the border state said, people in my state don't expect the federal government to do anything. It's been so many years since they've done anything. It's time for us to prove they're wrong. We have the authority, we have the opportunity, we have the challenge. Making this sort of request on the floor, I know, is symbolic, but I have to say that it's not the symbolism we should follow, and I object.
It's heard. The senior senator from Utah.
Madam President, I appreciate the sentiment expressed by my friend and distinguished colleague, the senior senator from Illinois, particularly when he expressed a desire no longer to have people send their children on the long, perilous journey from Central America to the United States. On that, he and I certainly agree, just as we've agreed on a number of other issues over the years. I do think it's regrettable we're not able to reach this agreement today. This is something we ought to be able to solve right here, right now. This is a very dire set of circumstances, and we have to remember what we're talking about dealing with the Flores agreement. We're in a position where so many of the children coming up through these caravans are in danger because we've got in place policies that require the release of minors to any adult claiming to be the child's parent. We ought to have expedited processing requirements for unaccompanied minors, just as we have in place already for unaccompanied minors coming from Mexico and coming from Canada. It makes me wonder, what is it about children from Central American countries, from any country other than Canada and Mexico, that makes them undeserving of that same expedited processing requirement? This is something we need to do. And yeah, I understand our immigration system is a mess and it needs reform, but I don't understand why it is that anyone would want to accept the default assumption we can't fix anything with immigration. We can't even fix this problem subjecting these unaccompanied minors from Central American countries, including Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Why can't we give them any relief here until such time as we can come up with a comprehensive immigration reform proposal? It's disappointing to me that we can't do that today. We will keep trying, we'll keep moving on this effort. This is important. And there's, look, regardless of where one stands politically, what party one belongs to, I don't think it's too much to ask to suggest that we shouldn't give kids over to anyone claiming to be their parent without any proof, without processes to make sure that that's a safe person. We wouldn't want our own children treated that way, and we shouldn't treat them that way. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President,
Senator from Illinois.
I have a unanimous consent request. I ask unanimous consent that cloture on calendar number 30, the nomination of Adewale Adeyemo to be Deputy Secretary of Treasury be withdrawn, and that notwithstanding Rule 22 on Thursday, March 25th, at a time to be determined by the Majority Leader, in consultation with the Republican Leader, the Senate proceed to the executive session and vote on the nomination without intervening action or debate, that if confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, that for no further motions be in order, that any related statements be printed in the record, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, as Senate then resume a legislative session.
Is there objection? Without objection. Senator from Iowa.
I want to come to the floor to bring up 4 subjects. The first one's 30 seconds. We hear from Democrats that they want to do things in a bipartisan way. Last year, Senator Wyden and I developed a bipartisan bill that would save the taxpayers $95 billion and reduce the cost of prescription drugs. Everybody wants that. President Trump wanted it. President Biden wanted it. And there's no reason why in 1 week we couldn't get that bill passed, and we don't have to wait until several weeks down the road to do something like that. It didn't come up last Congress because both Senators Schumer and Senator McConnell were against it. It's bipartisan. We ought to move on that. On another subject, over the years, the consolidation of the beef industry has threatened the livelihood of Iowa farm families and rural communities where they reside. and it isn't limited to just Iowa. This would be farmers all over the country. I've been working since 2002 to increase the producers' leverage against processors, improve market price discovery, and better situate independent Iowa cattlemen in the fed cattle markets. This past year, these issues became even more apparent and urgent because of the COVID pandemic. While the cattle industry has internally looked for ways to increase the amount of cash trade, it has not been able to find a solution. Unfortunately, this means that government intervention is needed, as it is past time for a solution. Government then needs to step in to guarantee that the free market treats cattlemen fairly. From the 2012 USDA agriculture census to the 2017 agriculture census, Iowa lost nearly 1,500 cattle producers. While we don't have USDA statistics from the past 2 years, the release of the 2022 USDA agricultural census will likely see an even more dramatic loss of producers because of the pandemic. I know this because of my many conversations I have with independent producer cattlemen from nearly every county in Iowa. During my meetings in all 99 Iowa counties, cattle market transportation and my bill introduced last Congress with Senator Tester mandating 50% of negotiated cash trade in the cattle market is one of the most mentioned topics at those county meetings. The aid that Congress offered via the USDA coronavirus food assistance program provided over $7 billion in assistance to cattle producers so far. However, this assistance is merely a Band-Aid covering a gaping wound. Congress must step up again and instead of providing payments to producers, make sure that producers have access to fair and transparent markets. From the Holcomb, Kansas fire at the Tyson's facility to the widely reported closures of processing plants due to the coronavirus outbreaks, we continue to see a wide disparity between the cash price of fed cattle and the price of boxed beef, which in turn affect consumer cost. Normally, the packer spread between the price of live cattle and boxed beef is about $2,100 per hundredweight. But USDA's report on the coronavirus shutdowns showed that last May this spread was $279 as opposed to that usual $21 per hundredweight, the highest since reporting began 20 years ago. It is just part of a pattern that has evolved during my time in the Senate. That pattern is farmers getting a smaller amount of the overall dollar for their food production. I appreciate the leadership from Secretary Perdue in issuing their USDA report last August, and that report helps the cause for the Grassley tester legislation. Beyond just highlighting problems, Perdue also offered recommendations, one of which was for Congress to consider a mechanism to mandate a level of negotiated cash trade. This is not a new issue in the beef industry. In fact, I first introduced a bill that would mandate cash trade way back almost 20 years. Today, on behalf of Iowa's independent cattle producers, I'm proud to reintroduce my bill with Senator Tester to mandate negotiated cash trade at 50%. Without a mandated amount of cash trade, producers continue to be residual suppliers and will lack leverage to fairly negotiate with packing companies. Early this month, Senator Deb Fischer of Nebraska introduced the Cattle Market Transparency Act of 2021. There are some excellent provisions in Senator Fisher's bill, such as the creation of a contract library, as well as new required reports on the number of cattle scheduled for delivery. These provisions will add great transparency and great price discovery. They're important to Iowans as they are to Nebraskans. However, when it comes to a negotiated amount of cash trade, Senator Fisher's bill only mandates a regional minimum. This means price discovery would still be reliant upon cattle producers who already are negotiating. So what is price discovery? Well, put simply, price discovery is where a buyer and a seller agree on a price and a transaction occurs. Cattle producers of all sizes and in all regions recognize that price discovery is a public good, a very good public good. These producers also realize that the thinning of the cash market is a serious problem for all market participants. Producers in the Midwest of the United States, reporting regions, already provide ample price discovery by putting in hard work and selling cattle using negotiated means at nearly 60%. They do this while producers who sell with formulas use these prices in their contracts. That's why something must be done. Any legislative solution should address the imbalance of the cash trade across the entire beef belt. So my bill with Senator Tester would simply shift the burden of price discovery from independent producers like those in Iowa and spread it evenly among all cattle producers. I'm looking forward to working with Senator Fisher and the entire Senate Agriculture Committee to make permanent changes in mandatory price reporting, which needs to be reauthorized by September 30th of this year. Cattle producers are counting on us to make changes. We can no longer take a wait and see approach. The beef industry employs hundreds of thousands of hardworking men and women who work each day to help feed our country and the world. But the USDA agricultural census shows we are losing these producers. I'm asking my colleagues in the Senate to co-sponsor my bill with Senator Tester and to ensure then that the strength of the supply chain and the support for our cattle producers. Then on another subject, I want to speak about the border crisis created in the Biden administration. I spoke on this subject just last week, and the situation has not improved since then. Encounters with family units and unaccompanied alien children continue to increase. There are now new reports that in some segments of the border, illegal immigrants are being released into the interior of the United States without receiving a notice to appear in an immigration court. To be clear, it appears that the administration is now releasing some illegal immigrants into the United States without even attempting to give them an immigration court date, much less taking any real steps to ensure that they actually schedule their hearing and show up for their court date in the future. So, once again, this is totally unacceptable. This is catch and release without even pretending to care whether the immigrants show up for court or are removed from the country in the future. This is also not sustainable. Every sovereign nation has a right as well as a duty to its citizens to control its borders. When what we're seeing from this administration isn't border control or security. You see it on television. It's chaos. It's what happens when you broadcast to the world that you have no intention of enforcing our nation's immigration laws. The president could take action to end this crisis today if he actually wanted to. He could restore migrant protection protocols and the asylum cooperative agreement that the Trump administration signed with El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. He could start building a more physical infrastructure along our southern border, as administrations of both parties have done for over 20 years, including the administration which Biden served as vice president. So fencing isn't something new, and it has not been a partisan issue until just here lately. Rather than propose unserious blanket amnesty legislation that contains no real border security, the president could work with Congress on a common sense changes to our immigration laws that we all know are needed. Finally, the president could make clear that he is in favor of fully enforcing our immigration laws as written across the board, remembering that he takes an oath that has the words to faithfully execute the laws. Unfortunately, this administration believes that the surge in migration at the southern border due to its policies is a process to be managed rather than a crisis to be stopped. As long as that's the case, we won't be able to truly secure our border and cut off the flow of illegal immigration to this country. Let's hope things change soon. And then on one other very short matter, I want to speak about something that's going on in the House of Representatives that I think we all ought to abhor. Congress should not overturn a legal state-certified election. I defended President Trump's right to litigate claims of election irregularities in our independent court system and deferred to the judgment of independent judges. I was initially criticized for that position by partisans on the left who wanted me to make some sort of independent determination of election claims before the courts had ruled. I maintained that my deference to independent judges once the court had ruled and Trump partisans did not like the rulings. So what happened? It led to criticism of me from the right then. When objections were raised to counting certain state electoral votes based upon state-certified elections, I voted against overturning those elections. My position remains the same with respect to the purpose of my remarks today, and that is the state-certified election of Representative Miller Meeks, who now ably represents Iowa's 2nd Congressional District. Miller Meeks's opponent chose to forego her rights under Iowa law to present any claims of election irregularities to an independent panel of judges. Guess what? That's because under Iowa law, she has no legal claim. Representative Miller Meeks won fair and square as certified by Iowa's bipartisan election board. The House Administration Committee is moving forward with the process to overturn this certified election, stating it will exercise its discretion to depart from Iowa law. That's a quote I just gave from information given to the House Administration Committee. They are proposing that the House of Representatives exercises its discretion to depart from Iowa law. They were elected under Iowa law. Every one of the 435 congressmen were elected under the laws of their state, and isn't a little bit outrageous that people would say we ignore the law of Iowa in this case. I hope that we can get every one of Iowa's 4 Congress men and women to vote to keep Miller Meeks in office. I want to hear from every one of my colleagues that decried overturning state certified elections in January if they still hold that attention. And of course, even attention to the press gallery. I was asked more times than I can count if I accepted the results of the presidential election. It would be very timely and a very relevant question to ask senators in the hallways if they accept the certified election of Representative Miller Meeks. I yield the floor.
The senator from Vermont.
Madam President, I'm glad to hear the distinguished senator, my colleague and friend, speak about the problems on the southern border. I feel for President Biden because he inherited a horrible mess from his predecessor, a man who said that he would build a wall, which he didn't, a wall that would stop immigration, which he didn't, that he would build it saying he would get the money from Mexico, knowing that he would not get 1 cent from Mexico, but he repeated that falsehood hundreds of times around this country, and gave us, and also actually took money away from housing for families on our military bases, families living in substandard housing. The money that the Congress had voted to repair that housing, to make it safe, to remove lead, mold, and so on, he took that money to build the wall, which, as I said, he claimed that Mexico would pay for. I wish what we had done when I was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, we passed by about a 2-to-1 margin after months and months and months of debate and work, an immigration bill here in the Senate, Republicans and Democrats voting for it, something that could have solved all this problem. It went over to the House of Representatives. There were enough votes to pass it there, but it would not be a majority of the Republicans. And the Republican speaker said they could not bring up the bill, even though it passed, because it was violating a rule very sacred to them, a rule named after Dennis Hastert, a former speaker, and they could not violate the great respect they had for Dennis Hastert and his rule, and so even though it passed, they did not bring it up. Of course, it's subsequent to that Dennis Hastert went to prison for child abuse. Now, on another matter, entirely different matter, I want to speak about a dear friend. U.S. Second Circuit Court Judge Peter Hall, who died on March 11th. And ever since then, I've thought back to the conversation I had with him, just like many, many conversations I've had with Judge Hall over the years, but I had one just a few days before he died. He was telling me about the health concerns he had, very serious ones, but he was going to try one other thing that weekend. We hope may give him a longer spell of life. Well, it didn't. It was only a matter of days after that last, as I said, one of many conversations I had with him. A few days after that last conversation, he died. He died on March 11th, and 1 week after announcing his decision to take senior status. And Chief Judge of the Second Circuit, Judge Deborah Ann Livingston, gave a remarkable tribute when she acknowledged his death. Speaking for the court, Chief Judge Livingston said, Judge Hall was our beloved colleague, and this is a grievous loss for our court and for all of our judges. Over the course of nearly 17 years on the Court of Appeals, Judge Hall distinguished himself as a thoughtful and humane jurist. He was generous with his colleagues, ever considerate in matters both big and small. Judge Hall was committed to public service. He taught us all by his example. He was a kind and very dear friend. This is a sad day for the judges of the Court of Appeals. Now, a deeper read of the two-page announcement offered more insight to help us understand what made Judge Hall the exceptional jurist that he was. She noted that he left a lasting mark on a generation of law clerks. And Chief Judge Livingston shared an anecdote as told by one of those clerks. She said, one winter morning we were working away in chambers and he had not turned up. Not unusual, but we were all wondering if something had happened. He rode in midday with his dirty work pants and torn flannel shirt. In other words, no more haggard than usual. He explained that he had taken his truck through the woods that morning after taking care of his horses, but had gotten stuck. Luckily, he had an axe. So it was only a matter of chopping down a few trees to put under the truck tires for traction. He freed himself and made his way into chambers like it was nothing. Just another day in the Second Circuit. Chief Judge Livingston repeated that story told by one of Judge Hall's clerks. But you know, the story speaks of the person Judge Hall was. Never too important to carry out the chores of the day, never too far from the Vermont woods that he loved so much. I know how many times I would talk with him, and we might talk a little bit about the law or things like that, then we'd quickly go to tales of other Vermonters we knew, things they had done, places that we liked, especially in our state. And I thought as more tributes have flooded in, the most common remembrances of Judge Hall include words such as decent, gentle, caring. His long career, which spanned years in both private practice and as a federal prosecutor before joining the bench, demonstrated his commitment to the rule of law. It was a commitment that he showed early on when he served as president of the Legal Aid Clinic while still earning his Juris Doctorate at Cornell Law School. When I was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee in 2003, I was proud to recommend Peter Hall for the Circuit Court vacancy left by the passing of another dear friend, Judge Fred I. Parker. And no surprise to me that his nomination was met with very little resistance either from the White House or from Republicans and Democrats alike on the Judiciary Committee. I teased him sometimes about the fact he was born in Hartford, Connecticut, but moved to Vermont at the age of 11. Did that make him a real Vermonter? And the reaction I got from him was, Patrick, my great-great-grandfather served as governor of Vermont in the mid-1850s. I had to admit, Judge had me there. He always considered Vermont his home, and we're grateful that he did. Marcel and I enjoyed our friendship, and we send our sincere condolences to his wife, Maria Dunton, his 5 children, his 5 grandchildren. I would also note, in concluding, that Judge Hall's former law clerks released a touching tribute. And I will ask consent in a moment, to be printed in the record along with a list of their names. Over 60 law clerks. And I ask consent that the conclusion of my remarks, their statement and their names be included in the record.
Without objection.
Madam President, Vermont and the legal community of the federal bench have lost a great champion of justice. As Chief Judge Livingston concluded in her statement, Peter Hall lived a life of fidelity to principles, kindness to individuals, and service to the human community. He'll be greatly missed. This is a great truth. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Minnesota.
Madam President, I want to also just thank my colleague from Vermont for that lovely tribute to Judge Hall. I can see that he meant a lot to you and was a great public servant. So thank you, Senator Leahy. Madam President, in a year of so much heartbreak and grief and death, it almost escaped notice that we had gone in this country a year without a mass shooting in a public place. But now we face the grim reminder of our American reality. In the space of a week, 2 separate mass shootings stole the lives of 18 people. And just weeks ago, we suffered a mass shooting in a health clinic in my home state of Minnesota. So here we are again, thrust into a familiar cycle of collective grief and frustration and anger. Our hearts break for the families and loved ones of those whose lives were stolen. Our voices cry out for change to end the scourge of gun violence. And our anger grows as our voices are ignored and we are told by Republican leaders that there is nothing that we can do to protect American lives from gun violence. Colleagues, it is our job to protect American lives. Today, I want to share with you the voice of Veronique de la Rosa. Her son, Noah, just 6 years old, was murdered in his classroom at Sandy Hook Elementary. And she delivered this eulogy for her son at his 2012 funeral. And I'm going to read it in its entirety so that it can be included in the record, this congressional record, and can serve as a reminder of the human toll that our gun culture has taken. Veronique said, "The sky is crying and the flags are at half-mast, and it is a sad, sad day. But it is also your day, Noah, my little man. I will miss your forceful and purposeful little steps stomping through our house. I will miss your perpetual smile, the twinkle in your dark blue eyes, framed by eyelashes that would be the envy of any lady in the room. Most of all, I will miss your visions of your future. You wanted to be a doctor, a soldier, a taco factory manager. It was your favorite food, and no doubt you wanted to ensure that the world kept producing tacos. You were a little boy whose life force had all the gravitational pull of a celestial body. You were light and love, mischief and pranks. You adored your family with every fiber of your 6-year-old being. We, all of us, elevated in our humanity by having known you. A little maverick who didn't always want to do his schoolwork or clean up his toys, who practiced his ninja moves or Super Mario on the Wii seemed far more important. Noah, you will not pass this way again. I can only believe that you were planted on earth to bloom in heaven. Take flight, little boy, my boy, soar. You now have the wings that you always wanted. So go to that peaceful valley that we will all one day come to know. I will join you someday, not today. I still have lots of mommy love to give to Danielle and Michael, Sophia and Ariel. Until then, your melody will linger in our hearts forever. Mama loves you, little man." Veronique should not have had to eulogize Noah, her 6-year-old son, one of 20 children killed at Sandy Hook. So I ask my Republican colleagues to think of her when you suggest that families exaggerate their anger, their anguish for political gain. Just yesterday, one of my Republican colleagues dismissed this grief as theater. No, this is life and death. So I'm angry. I am angry because I know that we have the power to stop this violence. And yet, our Republican colleagues stand in the way. They refuse to work with us. They continue to put the demands of the NRA above the demands of the people we are elected to serve. That we stop this horrific gun violence, that we protect the people that we are elected to serve. Madam President, we need universal background checks. We need to ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. We need to end this cycle. And we need all of us in Congress to find the strength and the humanity to take action. Madam President, I yield the floor.
The senator from Maine.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, small businesses and their employees are the backbone of our economy, particularly in states like those of the presiding officer and the state that I'm privileged to represent, the great state of Maine. Later today, the Senate is slated to vote on cloture on the motion to proceed to H.R. 1799, the PPP Extension Act of 2021. As the sponsor of the Senate companion bill, along with my colleagues, Senator Cardin and Senator Shaheen, I urge my colleagues to support the cloture motion. We're also delighted that several of our colleagues have joined us as co-sponsor of the Senate companion bill. Madam President, the Paycheck Protection Program continues to be a lifeline for small businesses. It has made the difference between their shutting their doors and laying off their employees and their being able to remain open, survive the pandemic, and most important of all, send paychecks to their employees. Since the program was created last year, more than $718 billion in forgivable Small Business Administration loans have been approved, securing tens of millions of jobs in this country. The program has also been responsible for bringing approximately $3 billion to the state of Maine in forgivable loans that have allowed our small businesses, particularly those in the hospitality industry, to survive the pandemic and continue to send paychecks to their employees. The current application deadline for the PPP is March 31st. That is just days away, Madam President. I continue to hear about the urgent need for more PPP assistance from Maine small businesses and to hear from others who are eligible for assistance but whose financial institutions are getting error messages from the Small Business Administration's computer system. Originally, the SBA had used the E-Trans system. For some reason, it switched computers for this round of PPP, and we understand that there are more than 190,000 applications that are pending for approval, that are likely eligible for assistance, but are held up because of computer glitches or other errors. The bill before us today mirrors the legislation that I introduced with Senators Cardin and Shaheen, in that it provides for a clean extension of the PPP application deadline. It would simply extend the application deadline for PPP loans from March 31st to May 31st, just 2 more months. And then it would provide an additional 30 days for the SBA to process pending applications. So if a small restaurant, for example, applied for a second PPP loan for which it's eligible because its revenues are down by 25%, comparing similar quarters in 2019 and 2020. It would not lose out because it applied in May and the SBA did not get time to process the application. Madam President, our bill has been endorsed by more than 90 organizations, including the nation's largest small business advocacy group, the National Federation of Independent Business, which is key voting this vote. It has also been endorsed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the American Hotel and Lodging Association, the International Franchise Association, the National Restaurant Association, the U.S. Travel Association, and the Independent Community Bankers of America. The House passed this clean PPP extension last week by an overwhelming margin of 415 to 3. With the House now in recess and the Senate leaving this week, advancing a clean extension through the Senate ensures the continuation of this vital relief for our small businesses and their employees. We simply have to get this done. Now, Madam President, I agree with my colleagues that there are further improvements that could be made to PPP, such as addressing an issue facing certain sole proprietors. Unfortunately, the new administration changed the rules, so sole proprietors who applied early when the program reopened in January were treated differently than sole proprietors who are applying now. That obviously doesn't make sense. We should have the same rule. I have talked with the new SBA administrator about this problem. She agrees that it is unfair and needs to be fixed and has committed to working with all the sponsors and with the House and Senate Small Business Committee to find a solution to ensure that the program is implemented as Congress intended. But in order to ensure that there's adequate time to develop and implement these improvements, we must first, without delay, pass H.R. 1799 to keep the PPP open for another 2 months. I urge all of my colleagues to support cloture and passage of this important bipartisan legislation. It truly is vital. Thank you, Madam President.
The Senator from Wyoming.
I ask unanimous consent that Senator Murray and I be permitted to complete our remarks prior to the votes for up to 5 minutes each.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, today the Senate is going to vote on the nomination of David Turk, who will be serving as Deputy Secretary of Energy. If confirmed, he's going to play a critical role in our nation's energy agenda and in leading the department. His experience in energy policy is extensive. He served in leadership positions at the International Energy Agency, the U.S. Department of Energy, the U.S. Department of State, and the National Security Council. He's an expert in the field, and his qualifications are very clear. It's also clear from his nomination hearing that he is dedicated to all types of American energy. This is critical if we're going to keep America an energy-dominant nation. I especially appreciated his commitment to advance nuclear and carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration technologies. During his hearing, he said there are huge opportunities on carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration if we can work together and really go to scale. He also emphasized the need to construct CO2 pipelines to move the captured carbon, and I agree. Carbon capture technologies hold the key to major emission reductions while enabling America to use the tremendous natural resources in which we are blessed. This issue has broad bipartisan support. Last Congress, I worked with Democrats, including Sheldon Whitehouse and Tom Carper, as well as Republicans, including Shelley Moore Capito, to pass the Use It Act into law. This bipartisan law will support the development of carbon capture and direct air capture techniques. Now, this kind of groundbreaking research is already happening in Wyoming. The Integrated Test Center, located outside of Gillette, Wyoming, is hosting carbon capture research teams today. These research teams are looking at how we can take captured carbon emissions and transform them into marketable products like building materials, clothing, and even hand sanitizer. So I would welcome Mr. Turk and Energy Secretary Granholm to come to Gillette to see the fantastic research taking place there. Mr. Turk was also very responsive to the committee's questions for the record. That has not been the case with every one of President Biden's nominees so far. If he's confirmed, Mr. Turk must prioritize priorities and policies that take advantage of the enormous economic and national security benefits generated by America's oil, natural gas, and coal resources. The Biden administration has taken a sledgehammer to the economies of Wyoming and other western states by declaring war on these natural resources. Let me be very clear. Coal, oil, and natural gas are not going away. America is going to rely on these resources for decades to come. We need to use and promote every kind of American energy and the thousands of jobs that come with them. Coal, oil, natural gas, nuclear power, and renewables are all essential to America's energy mix. Mr. Turk demonstrated that he understood that reality during his nomination hearing. He can be sure that I will hold him to the commitments that he has made during his nomination hearing to expand carbon capture as well as nuclear power. I'm going to continue to hold the Biden administration accountable as well. And as I did in committee, Madam President, I will support Mr. Turk's nomination on the floor today. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to strongly urge my colleagues to support the nomination of Dr. Rachel Levine. She's a highly qualified public health expert to serve as Assistant Secretary for Health. As the highest-ranking health official in Pennsylvania, she led the state's COVID-19 response by focusing on transparency and clear science-based communication, giving daily briefings on the status of the pandemic, and advocating for the resources and support Pennsylvanians needed. Dr. Levine has been on the front lines of this pandemic, which is why she knows firsthand what our states and communities need from the Department of Health and Human Services. And even before this crisis, Dr. Levine established herself as a trusted voice to the people of Pennsylvania on matters of public health through her work to establish opioid prescribing guidelines and education for medical students, make life-saving treatment for opioid overdoses widely available, combat eating disorders, increase health equity, and help the LGBTQ community get health care. She was confirmed to both of her positions in the state with broad bipartisan support. She passed out of the Help Committee with support from Republican colleagues last week, and I hope she will be confirmed today in a strong bipartisan vote as well. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge what her confirmation today would represent for our country, because in addition to being a highly qualified nominee, Dr. Levine is also an historic one. Upon confirmation, she will be the highest-ranking openly transgender official in our government, and the first one ever confirmed by the Senate. I've always said the people in our government should reflect the people it serves, and today we will take a new historic step towards making that a reality. I'm proud to vote for Dr. Levine and incredibly proud of the progress this confirmation will represent for our country and for transgender people all across it who are watching today. I hope all of my colleagues are as well. I'd also like to say today how glad I am that yesterday we voted to confirm Dr. Murthy as Surgeon General. During his last tenure as Surgeon General, Dr. Murthy established himself as a trusted voice on matters of public health, helped see our nation through the Zika outbreak, and published groundbreaking reports on the opioid epidemic and rising youth tobacco use. I'm pleased to have Dr. Murthy returning to the role of Surgeon General at this critical time. Madam President, when it comes to ending this pandemic, we have a lot of work to do and no time to waste. We're going to need all the help we can get, particularly from experts like Dr. Murthy and Dr. Levine, to get it done. Thank you. I yield the floor.
The question occurs on the Levine nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennet, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Brown, Cantwell, Collins, Cortez Masto, Durbin, Hassan, Hickenlooper, Merkley, Murray, Ossoff, and Schumer. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Burr, Crapo, Hyde-Smith, Lee, Paul, Portman, Romney, Sass, and Scott of Florida. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Marshall, no. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Schatz, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Haggerty, no. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Peters, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Cassidy, Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Warner, Mr. Warner, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Moran, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Wyden, Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Kramer, no. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Casey, aye. Miss Stabenow, aye. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Booker, Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Murphy, Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wicker, no. Ms. Murkowski, Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Daines, Mr. Daines, no. Mr. Bennet, Mr. Bennet, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Ms. Ernst, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tillis. No. Mrs. Shaheen, Mrs. Shaheen. Aye. Mr. Warnock, Mr. Warnock. Aye. Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Fisher. No. Mr. Rubio, Mr. Rubio. No. Mr. Scott, Mr. Scott of South Carolina. No. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Miss Cinema. Aye. Mr. Hoven, Mr. Hoven. No. Mr. Coons, Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Johnson, no. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, no. This is my first.
On this vote, the yeas are 52, the nays are 48. The nomination is confirmed. The question occurs on the Turk nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennet, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Carden, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Arono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Blunt, Booker, Bozeman, Burr, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Coons, Cortez Masto, Kramer, Crapo, Daines, Durbin, Feinstein, Fisher, Graham, Hoeven, Inhofe, Kane, King, Lankford, Leahy, McConnell, Menendez, Murkowski, Peters, Reed, Risch, Romney, Rosen, Rounds, Scott of South Carolina, Shaheen, Shelby, Sinema, Smith, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Tuberville, Warnock, Warren, Wicker. Mr. Paul voted in the negative. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Braun, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mrs. Hyde Smith, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Rono, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye.
The yeas are 98, the nays are 2. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motions to reconsider are considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 11, H.R. 1799, the PPP Extension Act of 2021, signed by 16 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed H.R. 1799, an act to amend the Small Business Act and the CARES Act to extend the covered period for the Paycheck Protection Program and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennet, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr. Okay. Passing. Einstein. Padilla. Peters. Thank you. Smith's yep. Behind me. Who? Smith's over here. Warren. Jimmy Kennedy. I got you. Yep. I did.
Collins. Holly. No, Collins. Grassley. Gotcha. Move on. Garden, Coons. Thank you. I did, thank you. Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Carden. Thank you. Yep. Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, aye. Yes? You're an aye. Gotcha. Mr. Hoban, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee. Thank you. Thank you.
You're so persuasive.
I don't have sugar. Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lemus, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley. Thank you. Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla. Thank you. Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Bennet, Blackburn, Blunt, Brown, Burr, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Cassidy, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Daines, Duckworth, Durbin, Ernst, Feinstein, Fisher, Gillibrand, Grassley, Haggerty, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kane, Kennedy, King, Langford, Leahy, Lujan, Lummis, Manchin, Marshall, Menendez, Moran, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Romney, Rosen, Rounds, Rubio, Schatz, Schumer, Scott of South Carolina, Shaheen, Shelby, Sinema, Smith, Thune, Toomey, Tuberville, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, Wyden, and Young. Mr. Merkley? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Ms. Hirono? Aye. Mr. Warnock? Aye. Mr. Blumenthal? Aye. Mr. Marshall? Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Braun, Hawley, and Paul. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Cruz, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. No, Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Do you want me to turn it in?
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 96, the nays are 4, and the motion is agreed to. Cloture having been invoked, the Senate will resume legislative session, and the motion to proceed to H.R. 1799, which the clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 11, H.R. 1799, an act to amend the Small Business Act and the CARES Act to extend the covered period for the Paycheck Protection Program and for other purposes.
The Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that following morning business tomorrow, all post-closure time on the motion to proceed to calendar 11, H.R. 1799, the PPP Extension Act be considered expired and the motion to proceed be agreed to, that the only amendments in order be the following: Kennedy, number 1401, Rubio, number 1405. Further, that it be in order for Senator Paul or his designee to raise a Budget Act point of order. Finally, that at 11 a.m. tomorrow, the Senate vote in relation to the amendments in the order listed and on the motion to waive, if made, that if the motion to waive is agreed to, the bill be considered read a third time, and the Senate vote on passage of the bill as amended, if amended, with 60 affirmative votes required for passage, all with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I would I would make another request. I have 14 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
It is hard to believe that I'm on this floor again after losing 10 more people, this time in Boulder, Colorado, to another horrible mass shooting in our state. I'm sure the presiding officer doesn't remember that last week, after the events in Atlanta, I came over to your desk and I said that we were so sorry in Colorado for what had happened in Atlanta, and then just 3 or 4 days later, it happened again in Colorado. And I've spent the past day learning about the victims of this terrible crime, and I want America to know what extraordinary human beings we've lost in my state. Here they are, Mr. President. Denny Stong, age 20. Denny was a graduate of Fairview High School, an introverted, smart kid who loved history and model airplanes. He'd been covering shifts at the King Super and took enormous pride in his role as an essential worker during this pandemic. He once posted on Facebook, "I can't stay home. I'm a grocery store worker." Nevin Stanisic, age 23. Nevin's dad said he was a really good boy, good kid, a hardworking boy. His parents are refugees from Bosnia who left in the 1990s to escape the war. The reverend at their local church said
His family fled the war, and everything they had was either left behind or destroyed. They left everything to save their lives and came here to have a new start, said the pastor. They came to America to have a new start, only to have their son's life ended by this senseless act of violence. Ricky Olds, Mr. President, was 25 years old. Ricky had been working as a manager at King Soopers for 6 years. Her family described her as a firecracker who lit up a room with her infectious giggle. Her Aunt Lori said she had a beautiful way of just being her. When you're down, she just wanted to cheer you up just by being around. Trelana Bartkowiak, age 49. She co-owned a clothing and accessories store, Unbeloved, with her sister and was a frequent presence in the Boulder arts and music scene. She had a deep curiosity about the world that took her on travels from Nepal to Costa Rica. Her younger brother remembers her as a beam of light. Tori Liker, age 51. She was a huge fan of the Buffaloes at CU, a regular face at the Pearl Street Stampede. A friend called Terry the most selfless, innocent, amazing person I have had the honor of meeting. Suzanne Fountain, 59 years old. She worked for 15 years in the Boulder Community Hospital. She loved gardening and was passionate about music and theater. A friend described her as the cream of the crop and a good person, a good soul. Kevin Mahoney, age 61. Kevin had worked in the hotel business but retired early to spend more time traveling, skiing, and visiting his daughter, Erica. After learning of her father's death, Erica wrote, "My dad represents all things love. I'm so thankful he could walk me down the aisle last summer. Lynn Murray, age 62. Lynn was a mother of two and a retired photo director for prominent national magazines. Her husband, John, said, "I just want her to be remembered as this amazing, amazing comet, spending 62 years flying across the sky." Jody Waters, 65 years old. Jody used to own a boutique clothing store named Applause on Pearl Street Mall, where she remembered all her customers and their favorite brands. She was a mother of two and a grandmother who loved horses and hiking. A friend said when Jody walked into the room, she was a breath of fresh air, a light. Finally, Officer Eric Talley. He's 51 years old. He's a man of deep faith and a devoted father of 7. After losing a close friend to a DUI, he joined the police academy at age 40, just 11 years ago, to give back to the community. In 2013, he made headlines when he helped rescue 11 ducklings from a drainage ditch. Eric's father said he loved his kids and family more than anything. For their sake, he was hoping to stay off the front lines by learning to become a drone operator. But when the bullets rang out, he rushed into action, first on the scene, saving countless lives at the cost of his own. Officer Talley and these other folks represent the best of Colorado. And we certainly owe Officer Talley a debt of gratitude we'll never be able to repay. Mr. President, my heart goes out to all the families and the entire community of Boulder. We have endured too many tragedies as a state. So many other states are the same here. The shootings at Columbine High School happened right before my oldest daughter was born, Caroline Bennet. She's 21 years old. And her entire generation has grown up in the shadow of gun violence. Something none of us had to do. I remember, Mr. President, after a gunman in Las Vegas took the lives of 59 Americans. That was a Monday that I came to work and realized during the course of the day that I was having meeting after meeting after meeting, and nobody was mentioning the massacre of 59 Americans. I don't know if it was 2 or 3 or 4 of these events before that we began to somehow accept this as normal. That you could lose that many people and not have a conversation about what had happened. The headlines all moving on to the next thing. And we can't allow this to become normal. And it's not just the mass shootings, it's the daily shooting the presiding officer and I talked about last week that have happened in Atlanta over the last couple of weekends, or on the west side of Chicago. So we can't move on. Boulder will heal, but this scar will always be there. My daughter's generation will always bear the burden of a national government that did nothing to protect them. They and the children that I used to work for in the Denver public schools, they carry a burden that we didn't carry. They have grown up with a reasonable fear that they will be shot in their classrooms or in their schools or at a movie theater or in any public place. I didn't grow up in an America with more gun-related deaths than virtually any country in this world, and we can't accept it for their America. I'm not asking anybody here to show the courage that Officer Talley showed, or the other men and women of law enforcement who constantly have to deal with the inability of this place's capacity to deal with these issues. Just asking us to show an ounce of their courage by doing whatever we can to keep weapons of war out of our communities, to pass universal background checks, to limit the size of magazines, to address the epidemic crisis of mental health in this country. Seems like that would be the least that we could do. In the wake of one of these incidents, I heard somebody say on a radio program that this was just the price of freedom. That these murders are the price of freedom. What a shame that somebody would say that and mean it. What a surrender that represents to our children and to the victims of these crimes. What a sacrifice of their right to be free from fear. Who are we to insist that they live terrified in their own country? Nobody insisted that we live that way, but our failure to act has helped create these conditions, and we can't wait any longer. The Senate needs to act. There's nobody else to act but the United States Senate. I want to end by thanking my colleagues from Connecticut, Senator Blumenthal and Senator Murphy, for their incredible, steadfast leadership for long before they came to the Senate. But I remember as one of the darkest moments of my Senate career, the votes that we took after Newtown, when that elementary school, Sandy Hook, was shot up. 20 students were killed. And this Senate couldn't even pass universal background checks. And they're here tonight to continue to make the case that we need to act. And I want to, again, thank them for their resilience and for caring about the people who lived and died in Colorado. I'm extremely grateful for their example. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.